The sun was falling slow, bleeding gold across the hard-baked earth, and the wind that whispered through the tall prairie grass carried no mercy. A girl sat by the roadside, alone. She was shaped like the hills round, soft, weathered by seasons. Nat didn't ask if she was ready. Her cheeks were full, flushed from sun and sorrow. Her fingers were curled around a worn bonnet, the lace fraying at the edges like her hope. Her name was Clara May. Behind her, 2 long wagon tracks led into the west, the kind that promised new beginnings for some, but they'd left her behind, and all she had left now was the dust rising where their wheels had vanished. She didn't sob loudly. That had passed hours ago. Now, the tears came in silence, slipping down her face like morning dew. Unnoticed by anything but the wind, she'd followed a man with dark boots and slick promises. His name was Jeb Mallory, and he had a crooked smile that made folks believe he knew what he was doing. He'd looked Clara up and down when he first saw her, a farm girl, helping the preacher's wife at the church fair. She was kneading dough with her whole body, flour on her chin, sweat on her brow, and he'd leaned close and said, "You ain't like the others. That's good. I don't want no frail wife." He said he wanted someone with hips, strong enough for the frontier. Said she was solid. She didn't know then that solid was just a word men like him used when they wanted warmth and work from a woman, but none of the honor. She packed her few things in a potato sack and left with him the next morning. He said they were heading west, to open land, wild orchards, a home of their own. She dreamed of chickens, pie crusts cooling on the sill, quilts drying in the sun. She thought she was going to be a wife, but she was just a weight in his wagon. And when the trail got rough, and the horses grew lean, and the days stretched dry and long, he looked at her like she was the reason. He called her slow, called her heavy for the oxen, and this morning, without so much as a goodbye, he'd taken the wagon, the food, the water barrels, and left. He left her with a half-full canteen, a slice of cornbread, and a note that said, "You'll slow me down. Better off staying put." So, Clara sat, and the day passed, and the sun began to fall. There was no shade, no shelter, only sky above, and the curve of the earth below. She thought of standing and walking, but where? She had no map, no horse, no direction, and truth be told, there was a part of her that didn't want to go on, not out of weakness, but out of weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from a life of being almost loved and half-wanted. She'd been too much for the seamstresses who wouldn't make dresses in her size, too slow for the boys who ran, too quiet for the girls who gossiped, too soft for her own father, who said, "You'll never get a man eating like that." But now, there was no one left to impress, just sky and dirt. And the truth, the evening wind grew sharp. It tugged at her sleeves. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her and curled near a rock, using it like a backrest, somewhere far off. A coyote cried. She closed her eyes and whispered into the settling dark, "If this is where it ends, let the wind carry me gentle. I ain't mad, just tired." And the stars began to appear, one by one, like freckles on the face of heaven. The prairie cooled, and the sky turned lavender. And Clara, for the first time in her short, heavy-hearted life, felt completely invisible. But she wasn't alone. Not entirely. Somewhere in the trees beyond the slope, a shadow stirred. A man, tall, silent, wrapped in old leathers and dust-colored thoughts, stood watching. He had a hunting rifle slung across his back, a pack on one shoulder, and a long scar running from jaw to collarbone. His name was Silas Boone, though nobody called him anything these days. He was no outlaw, but he didn't wear a badge either. He lived like the hills, still unseen, useful only if you listened long enough. Silas didn't know this girl, didn't know her story, didn't know her name, but something about the way she sat, the way she didn't cry out, the way her shoulders folded like worn linen. It stirred something in him, something old, something quiet. He didn't step forward. Not yet. There was time. She was breathing, and the prairie had a way of making folk honest. He would wait until dawn. The moon rose, and Clara May, too tired to cry, finally let herself sleep, not from peace, but because her body had given everything it had. She lay on her side, arms wrapped around herself like a child who never got held enough. The wind softened. A soft paw print pressed into the dust nearby. A dog, old, mottled, loyal, sniffed the air and looked back toward the trees. Silas's voice was a whisper through the pines. Easy, Whiskey. We ain't ghosts, and she ain't gone yet. And under the wide, wild sky, the prairie held its breath. The forest woke before the sky did. A soft hush between the trees, mist curling low along the roots, birds still too sleepy to sing, and somewhere, the faint rustle of a coat brushing against pine needles. Silas Boone moved like memory, soundless, spare, belonging to the land as much as the rocks or the wind. He was a man shaped by distance from people, from comfort, from expectations. He hadn't always been alone, but time and silence had a way of emptying a man's life until all that remained was what mattered. A rifle that never jammed, a dog that always came back, and a fire that stayed lit through the worst kind of nights. He had no cabin to return to. Not really. Just a small shack he'd built himself deep in the wooded crook of the hills, half covered in vines, camouflaged with age. It wasn't a home. It was a pause. But today, something had shifted. He'd seen her the night before, the girl lying still by the roadside, her figure a soft hill against the flat, cruel plain. She hadn't made a sound, hadn't moved, but something in the way she curled, not as one who gave up, but as one who had been given away, had caught him like a fishhook to the chest. He hadn't approached. Not then. A woman left out like that. It wasn't his place to charge in like some savior. But dawn was here, and the prairie didn't wait forever. He found her exactly where she'd been, though now her breath was shallow, her canteen empty, the crust of cornbread untouched. The wind had tugged her shawl halfway down her shoulder. Her skin was pale, lips cracked, but she was alive, barely. Silas didn't speak. Words could bruise. Instead, he knelt, pressed 2 fingers to her neck, felt the faint thrum of life. He whispered, more to the wind than to her, "Well now, you held on." With the ease of someone used to carrying deer through bramble, he lifted her in his arms. She was warm and weighty, not like burden, but like truth. And the dog, Whiskey, patted close, sniffing her toes and huffing once in approval. The cabin was small, 2 rooms, 1 bed, and a hearth that smoked when the wind turned east. But it was safe. It had held Silas through 3 winters, 2 fevers, and 1 broken soul. He laid the girl on the cot, tucked a wool blanket up to her chin, stoked the fire, heated water in a dented tin pot, then sat back in the corner chair and watched her, not in judgment, but in quiet guardianship. She stirred once in her sleep, muttered something like "Mama," then "Don't leave." Silas looked down at the floorboards. He knew that dream. 3 days passed. The girl did not speak the first day. She opened her eyes only briefly, drank water from the edge of a tin cup, fell back to sleep. The second day, she murmured something about cornbread and a wagon. He didn't ask. On the 3rd day, she sat up. The room smelled of wood smoke and time. Silas was tending the fire when her voice, hoarse but full of backbone, came from the bed. "You ain't him." He turned slowly. "No, ma'am." She looked around. Her hands gripped the quilt. "This your place?" He nodded. "You took me here." Another nod. She stared at him a long while. Her eyes were tired, but bright, like coals that hadn't gone out. "Why?" Silas didn't blink. Just said, soft as cedar bark, "Didn't seem right. Leaving a woman to die alone." She didn't respond to that. Just sank back into the cot and closed her eyes. but a tear slid down her temple. Not from fear, not from shame, but because someone had stayed. That evening she sat at the small wooden table, still wrapped in a blanket. Her hair was unbraided, curling at the ends, and her cheeks held color again. Silas ladled rabbit stew into 2 bowls. Sat across from her. They didn't say grace, but something holy hovered between them. She took a sip. Her shoulders softened. Then, almost shyly, she said, "Clara, that's my name." He nodded. "Silas." She nodded back. "Thank you, Silas." They ate. In silence. The days unfolded gentle, like linen drying in sun. Clara moved slowly, but with purpose. She swept the porch, mended a hole in the spare blanket, hummed low tunes from her childhood when she thought no one could hear. Silas didn't talk much, but he always carved little animals, birds, stars, leaving them on the windowsill like offerings. Clara found one shaped like a girl holding a lantern. She kept that one in her apron pocket. On the 6th day, Clara ventured outside. She stood on the porch in Silas's extra coat, watching the morning roll in. Mist rose from the earth, curling around her boots. Silas was chopping wood, sleeves rolled, sweat gleaming at his temples. He paused when he saw her. She looked away, shy. "It's pretty out here," she said. "Ain't bad," he replied. "You live out here alone?" He nodded. "Folk never took to me, so I took to the woods." She looked at him a long time. "Same," she whispered, and the wind moved like a sigh between them. That night, by the fire, Clara asked the question she'd been holding in her chest. "You gonna leave me too?" Silas stirred the coals, didn't answer right away. Then, softly, without turning, "I don't take what I ain't willin' to keep," and that was all. But Clara didn't cry. She smiled, just a little, the kind of smile that grows when someone finally sees the bruise you never spoke of and doesn't flinch outside. The hill slept. Inside, 2 souls sat in silence, sharing the warmth of firelight and something even rarer, peace. Spring arrived like a whispered apology. The snow that had curled over the ridges melted into thirsty soil. Green pressed upward from the ground like hope finally waking. Trees opened their arms to the sky again, and the brook near the cabin began to murmur with fresh water and frog song. Clara May stood barefoot in the patch of wildflowers that had bloomed near the woodpile, buttercups, bluebells, and a single stubborn dandelion growing from the cracks of a stone. Her dress was faded, but her figure stood tall, not hidden, not hunched, just there, like she finally believed the earth had room for her. She wore one of Silas's old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her apron was smudged with flour and pine needles. She hummed while gathering herbs into her palm. There was no audience, but her voice still filled the clearing like a lullaby, never meant to be sung aloud. Inside the cabin, a loaf of cornbread rose golden in the iron stove. On the table sat a jar of fresh honey, 2 carved wooden spoons, and a small, cloth-wrapped package, a new needle Clara had traded for at the edge of a nearby town, in exchange for mending an old woman's coat. She had walked there herself. It was just half a day's journey, and when she returned, Silas hadn't asked how she did. He only set a tin of water beside her and nodded toward the fire. But later, that night, he left a new carving on the windowsill. A small fox curled around a button. Clara found it at dawn, ran her thumb across its tail, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. They shared the days gently. Silas chopped, hunted, built. Clara cooked, tended, mended. But somewhere between the motions, something else grew, not loud or fast or fiery, but deep, like roots, like still water finding still water. They didn't speak of love. That kind of word felt too sharp, too sudden. But Silas began sitting a little longer after supper. Clara began folding his shirts a little slower, smoothing the sleeves, before setting them down. One night, She brought in a tiny bird's egg she'd found unbroken after a storm. She held it in both palms and whispered, "It's still whole." Silas looked at her then, really looked. Not with surprise, not with pity, with recognition. "So are you," he said, voice low as dusk. Later, she stood by the stream, toes in the mud, hair down her back like a dark curtain. She didn't know he was watching from the trees, not out of hunger or claim, but awe. Clara had once been left behind like a mule with a limp. Now she stood like a woman risen, not because someone saved her, but because no one could. They began trading stories. She told him of her mother, a seamstress with cracked knuckles and a soft laugh, of the cousins who made her feel like a burden, even as she carried their babies on her hip and scrubbed their sheets. She told him about the preacher's son, who asked her to dance once and then laughed when she said yes, and Silas spoke little, but one night, after a quiet supper, he looked into the fire and said, "My mama died when I was born. My PA blamed me for it. Never said the words, but I could feel it in every look." Clara didn't say sorry. She just set her hand beside his on the table, not touching, just near, and he left it there one day. Clara stitched herself a dress. She used a piece of pale blue calico that had been packed away in the loft, likely from some other settlers. Forgotten bag? The sleeves were a little uneven. The hem sat crooked on one side, but it fit, not tightly, not in shame. It draped like it belonged on her. She wore it only once, standing in the slanting evening light as the clouds blushed pink across the sky. The air smelled of thyme and wood smoke. Silas had just returned from hunting. He stepped onto the porch and froze. Clara turned toward him, her hands nervously smoothing the skirt. "It's not perfect," she said, "but I made it." Silas stared for a long moment, then stepped down the stairs. "You made it?" he asked. She nodded. He took one slow step forward. His eyes didn't waver. "Clara, that ain't just a dress." She looked down. "That's a declaration." She blinked. "Of what?" he answered, without smiling, without blushing. "That you ain't hiding anymore?" Her breath caught. Not from the words, but because he meant them. And for the first time in her life, a man saw her not as too chubby, not as a liability, not as a body to be used or pitied, but as whole, as worthy, as real. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But their hands brushed when she passed him the stew that night, and neither pulled away. The fire crackled. The dogs snored at their feet, and for once, the silence between two people didn't feel empty. It felt safe, but spring couldn't last forever. One morning, a letter came, delivered by a trader boy passing through. It was from the town Clara had left. The preacher's wife had written it. She'd heard whispers that Clara was alive, that she'd survived the winter, that she was living with a man in the hills. The letter said they would gladly accept her back into the church and that a woman's reputation can still be saved. Clara read it twice, then folded it, set it in the fire. Silas didn't ask what it said, but she looked at him across the room and said, "I'm not going back. I'm not someone who needs saving anymore." He nodded once. In the room, it bloomed with something unspoken but deep as the earth under their feet. That night, Clara asked softly, "Why didn't you ever marry Silas?" He stirred the stew. "I didn't want someone to fill a space," he said. "I wanted someone who could hold it with me." She looked down at her hands, then across the fire at him. "Would you let me hold it now?" He didn't smile, didn't move, just met her gaze and said, "You already are." Outside, the wind shifted. The season turned its face again, and inside the little cabin, something bloomed without name. Not desire, not need, but something truer. The wind was different that morning, not colder, not louder, but watchful, like the land itself was waiting. Clara felt it first. She stood outside the cabin, feeding chickens she'd nursed back to health from half-starved hens. Silas found tangled in barbed wire weeks ago. They clucked around her boots, their feathers puffed and proud. But Clara's spine tingled. The air felt too still, the trees too quiet. Inside, Silas was gone, off tracking a deer up toward Devil's Bluff. He'd kissed her forehead before dawn, the way he always did when he thought she was still asleep. But Clara was wide awake now. She set the feed bucket down, turned slowly, and saw the dust cloud rising from the trail below. The rider came fast, reckless, a single man, ragged coat, slouched hat, and a grin that hadn't changed, even after all this time. Jeb Mallory, the same man who had once left her to die on the roadside, called her too slow, too heavy, too much. He looked thinner now, meaner, the kind of man who hadn't eaten right in weeks and blamed the world for it. He slid off the saddle with a cocky flourish, dusted his coat, and smiled. "Well, I'll be damned. Ain't you a sight for sore eyes, Clara May?" Clara stood her ground. Her apron was tied, her boots firm in the dirt. "Didn't expect you to bloom out here like a wildflower. Must be that settler feeding you good," he chuckled, eyes scanning the cabin behind her. He inside, thought I might pay my respects. Clara didn't move, didn't blink. "Ain't nothing for you here, Jeb." His grin curled mean. "Now don't be like that girl. I heard you made yourself cozy. Got land, got supplies. Maybe even a little gold tucked away." He took a step forward. "I figured I'd come back for what's mine." Clara tilted her head, voice soft, steady. "You left me with nothing but a broken canteen and a footstep in the dirt." Jeb laughed. "And yet here you are, all fat and warm in the hills. Don't seem fair, does it?" He reached for the cabin door, and that's when Clara moved. She stepped between him and the porch, lifted the rifle that leaned by the coop, Silas's second one. She'd cleaned it just the week before. She aimed low, not to kill, but to warn. "Take one more step, and I swear by the fire that raised me, you'll limp back to hell with one less toe." Jeb froze, his grin cracked. "You wouldn't." She didn't answer with words. She fired. The bullet slammed into the dirt, near his boot, close enough to kiss the leather. The chickens scattered. The echo rang down the valley. Jeb's eyes went wide, not from pain, but from realization. Clara was not the girl he'd left behind. She was a woman now, one who had carved a life out of abandonment and fed it with her own hands. Whiskey barked then, loud and furious, and from the trees came the heavy footfall of a man returning fast. Silas appeared, rifle drawn, face carved from stone. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Jeb backed away, mounted his horse, spat on the ground and said, "You can keep her, Boone. Too much meat on the bones anyway." He kicked the horse and disappeared into the dust. Silas turned to Clara. Her hand still held the rifle, her breath still high in her chest, but her eyes were calm. He stepped toward her, slow. "You all right?" She nodded. "I kept us safe." He looked at her like a man might look at firelight after a year of winter. Then he dropped his rifle, crossed the space between them, and took her hands in his. "You didn't just keep us safe, Clara. You reminded me what it means to stay." That night, they didn't sit far apart. They sat close, by the fire, knees touching. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. There were no confessions, no oaths, thought only silence, and silence, in the right arms, can feel like forever. Later, in the quiet, Clara looked up and whispered, "If you'd found me just a day later." He shook his head. "Don't matter. I found you." She smiled. "I think I was meant to be lost." He smiled back. "And I was meant to find home." Outside, the wind stirred through the grass, soft and full of secrets. The stars blinked awake, and inside a cabin carved by weather and will, two people sat by firelight, not saved, but seen. Final whispers, so if they ever called you too much, too heavy, too soft, too anything. Remember Clara. She was left for dead, and she learned how to live. Not because someone rescued her, but because someone respected her, and because she finally respected herself. Asterisk, if this story settled deep in your heart, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, or someone you know who was once underestimated, leave us a comment. Let us know where you're watching from. Is it the wide prairies of Texas? A small village in Pakistan? A city where no one talks to strangers? We see you. We remember you. Like, comment, subscribe to Wild West Tales, where forgotten hearts find their place in the sun. We'll keep telling stories like Clara's, because sometimes the ones left behind become the ones who lead the way.